Hi everyone and welcome back to my channel. In today's video we're going to be having a big Declan Psy application Q&A. So before I get into that, if you're new around here, my name's Sharon and I'm an incoming trainee clinical psychologist. Please hit the subscribe button because I've got loads more videos on getting onto the Declan Psy and about my assistant psychologist role coming up in the next few weeks, so stay tuned for that. I am going to try and split this video up into 3 different sections so that the questions are a bit more organised. We're going to start off with your experiences, so what experience is needed prior to applying. Then we're going to move on to preparation in order to write the application, and then we're going to move on to the questions around structuring and writing the application itself. So there are quite a few questions, so let's get into it. Best ways / routes of experience at uni and afterwards. So at university, I would say try and get some volunteer work at a care home as a support worker, as a healthcare assistant, maybe try get a research assistant role alongside your uni, try and support any lecturers. So that's what you can do at uni. After uni, again, try and get an assistant post, an assistant psychologist post, a research assistant post. And also things like, it depends what route you want to go down, but you can do the clinical associate psychologist role, PWP training maybe if that's what you want to do. Hey everyone, Editing Shaz here. As you may or may not know, there have been changes to eligibility for funding for the Declan Psy. So if you train as a PWP or a CAP or a CWP or anything like that that's NHS funded, then you have to stay in that post 2 years post qualification before you can apply to the Declan Psy, so please keep that in mind. What else could you do? I've made loads of videos as well, so what I will do is I'll leave them linked below as well if you're curious to know what experience I'd recommend for after university. Is 1 year clinically relevant experience enough with a first and a master's? See, I really find these questions so difficult to answer because how long is a piece of string? I think it depends what you've taken away from that 1 year of experience, whether you understand how the NHS functions, how clinical psychology functions. I mean, academically, it sounds like you would be a very good contender, but I think the difficulty is the 1 year experience. But then I only had 1 year experience, so I don't think it should stop you from applying, but I don't think we can ever say X amount of years and X amount of academic experience or X grade will get you onto training. There's no formula. It really depends on what the university are looking for that year and also the other people that you're competing against. I would like to ask if it's possible to apply for a Declan Psy after 1 year as a crisis volunteer. If that's your only experience, I mean, I'm not too sure what a crisis volunteer entails, but I don't think honestly that will be enough, because my thoughts are you really need to be working in a role that allows you to showcase your skills as a psychologist. So even as a support worker, if you're working in a mental health service, then you still be using psychological models to inform your practice. And so I would just be curious to know whether as a crisis volunteer you are having to do that. And also thinking about how much responsibility you hold. Do you have any areas where you can practice leadership, because that's quite important for a developing psychologist. Also the fact that it's volunteer work. So a lot of the courses ask that you have paid experience prior to getting onto training. And I think the reason for that is because when you are a paid employee, you tend to have more responsibilities, you tend to have to manage a lot more different things, maybe people who have a bit more risk involved. I want to say probably not, you might need to get some paid experience, but it definitely depends on your role. How do you calculate hours per week with shift work? Thank you. I would look at your contract. If you are bank, then I believe you just write bank on the application and then the duration of your contract. But say if you're bank and you're working almost full-time hours, then I would just average the amount of hours that you're doing and then put it in like that. Due to COVID, my AP role hasn't given me the chance to run groups. Is that a problem? I had the exact same issue. How funny. I've never had any like group therapy experience, and I was so excited for my AP role because in both of the services I was going to have an opportunity to run groups, and I couldn't do that because of COVID, which was really annoying. But long story short, it's probably not a problem so long as you can think about how you would answer a question that might be about groups. I don't know if you do get asked about group therapy within the interview, but you might do, and so are you prepared to utilize the knowledge that you have now to answer that question, which you probably do if you're already doing one-on-one therapy. A lot of the skills as an AP, even if you're just doing one-on-one work, is very transferable. And so if a question did come up in an interview about groups, I would say, I don't have experience working in groups, but from working in one-to-one sessions, here's what I've learned and here's how I would use those skills to work in a group setting. Does UCL want a publication? So I don't know if it's like set in stone that they want it, but from speaking with other people in the field, so trainees, other assistants, that is kind of the said thing. So it is a rumour, so take this with a pinch of salt. I think because they are a more researchy course, they do like you to have a publication. If your reference is 2 to 3 years old, would that affect your outcome of your application? By 2 to 3 years old, do you mean that you haven't worked for them for 2 to 3 years? Because, I mean, either way, they do like a recent reference. So I would double check, and typically you need to ask your current employer for a reference. How did you use supervision to prep? Not sure how to structure this time to help. So truthfully, I didn't get my supervisors to read my application. I didn't really get any support from them for the application part. I did use some supervision time for the interviews, but in terms of when I was applying, I mainly used it as a space for self-care, to be honest. I spoke about the anxieties that I had, the way that it was impacting me, and also using supervision as I normally would to reflect on my experiences, which in turn and indirectly was benefiting my application because I was actively reflecting on my experiences, which you have to do in your application. So that's how I used it, but obviously other people will bring their application to supervision and let their supervisor read it. And it just depends on the relationship that you have with your supervisor and kind of what you want. But for me, I don't know, I've spoken about this in my vlogs, like I'm so comfortable with my supervisors, but because it was my first year applying, I just didn't know whether I wanted them to read it, because I thought if they read it and then maybe it's really bad and then they'd find out that I'm like some imposter and then maybe they would just fire me from my assistant job, which just wouldn't happen. But it was just some of my thoughts at the time. The big question, finding out the ethos and core competencies, if you could give an example. So finding out the ethos of the courses will come from their course description, which is found on the Leeds Clearinghouse website, or in the alternative handbook. So the alternative handbook has a question where it asks trainees to describe their course ethos in 3 words. And so that's literally where you would get this from. In terms of core competencies, I'll leave it linked down below. There's a document that the BPS have created which outlines the 9 core competencies that clinical training should give a psychologist. So that's where you need to look. Where to find out more about the different courses, Leeds Clearinghouse, or on the university courses themselves. Also head to Twitter, reach out to current trainees and ask. Everyone is pretty helpful. Is a month enough time to write the application? Yes, I think if you're quite good with your time, if you're organised, it's quite nice to be boundaried. Is it worth waiting till I have more experience before applying? Honestly, no. If you have the means to, I would say apply so that you have a practice year, and you never know what will happen. So if you do have the means to apply, then definitely go ahead and do it, because yeah, you just don't know. I mean, it was my first year, it was my practice year, and I got a place on the course, and so you may not think that you're ready, and actually sometimes that can work in your favour, because I actually went into the interview thinking, man, like, I'm probably not gonna make it, like, I don't even care anymore, like, whatever, this is just a bit of fun for me, it's a learning experience. And I think that came across in my interview, where I was more comfortable, confident, and less anxious. Something you wish you had done / prepared for? I think I would take the time to speak to more current trainees prior to applying, and I would also give my application to my supervisors to read, because actually they know what I do at work and I may have missed out on things I could have added in my application. I wish I was prepared for, you know, the longevity of the whole process. I didn't realise how long the process would feel, and so at the beginning I felt like I was sprinting when really I should have been maintaining a steady pace, because it's a marathon of a season. So yeah, I think going with that mindset, it's a marathon, not a sprint. While, you know, there are quiet parts of the process, 10 months is a long time. Where to start? It all feels so overwhelming. I know, and that is completely normal, honestly. I think for me, creating a schedule / a timetable really helped. I always do this when I'm feeling overwhelmed. I break the task down into smaller parts, and so the application seems massive because you've got your like demographic information, you've got your CV part, then you've got the 4 questions, and there's the references. Have those all as separate tasks in your head, or write them down, and then think about how much time you have, and then split those tasks up between the time that you have. That's how I would start. Start off with the easiest task, I'd say. I know some people go for the eat that frog method, but for this application, I couldn't eat the frog first. How far in advance would you start preparing for the application? I think in terms of like preparation, I would maybe start thinking about, or just collating all of your work history and your job roles that you've done. I think that's just quite handy to have in general. I wish I did that previously, where I had a Word document, essentially like a CV, but for myself, including all of the stuff that I did. I think that's really helpful. In terms of like planning and writing the application, don't start until application's open. You don't need to do it to yourself, like it's such a long process, so wait until September or whenever it is it opens. How did you decide on which courses to apply to? I answered this in one of my previous videos. I'll leave it linked down below and in the cards, but essentially I had, my main non-negotiable was the fact that I didn't want to move up north. I wanted to stay relatively near to London because that's home for me, and that narrowed down quite a few of the courses. Obviously, because I only have 1 year's postgrad paid experience, that limited me to the unis that I could apply to. And then also in terms of their ethos, I didn't really want a research heavy university, and so that narrowed it down quite a lot for me. So, how to structure the personal statement, e.g. by categories, chronological, etc. So I spoke about this in my last video. If you haven't checked it out, then go back and watch that, because that covers the whole application. It's very in-depth. And basically how I did it was I chose 4 values / ethos that were consistent across the 4 courses that I was applying to. I then used that as my structure. So I started off with value 1, and then moved on to value 2, and then moved on to value 3, and then value 4. And that's how I structured it. So it wasn't in chronological order. Maybe it was more kind of categorized in that way. So yeah, that's how I structured mine. Do I need to reflect on research experience in the personal statement? My experience is mainly clinical. So, I mean, if your experience is mainly clinical, then that's all you can write about, right? Like, I mainly have clinical experience. I don't have any research experience, so I only wrote about clinical. And if that's what's going to make you a better candidate for training, because that is the question, then you write about that and you reflect upon that. There is that question about research and dissemination of your work, so you could always reflect on that there. But I guess if you do have research experience, and it fits into your structure, so when thinking about the values, so say if one of the values that you pick up on is research, then obviously you're going to speak about research. But in the same way, if one of the values is innovation, then you would speak about research there, but then equally you could speak about clinical work in innovation. So think about how it fits into your application and your structure and the values, but don't put it in there for no reason. Did you prepare for interviews before you got the email that you'd been given one? So I'm not answering any questions about interviews, but hit the subscribe button, because I've got loads of content planned for interview prep, selection test prep, all of that, but I'm obviously not going to put that out now because that's so far in the future and I don't want to stress anyone out. Do you have an overall structure which is best to use for applications? So I think because I only applied once, I don't have a tried and tested structure. If I had to apply again, then I probably would approach it in the same way, where you pick out the 4 values / ethos that are consistent across the 4 courses, and then use that as your structure, because you don't have that many words to write your application in. So I think that structure is probably the best, rather than doing it in chronological order or in terms of like different jobs or whatever. I think this one is the most efficient. Top tips to make your application stand out. I'd say my biggest tip is to reflect on the things that you want to change maybe within the profession. Think about the kind of clinician you want to be, and that will allow your voice and your personality to shine through, because everyone says the way to stand out is to be yourself. And so what can you bring to your application to show your personal side yet still be professional? And I think the way to do that is to show your interest in professional issues and to think about where you want to be in the future and what you want to take away from training. Best way to approach the experience section without AP experience. The same way you would if you did have AP experience. The question isn't about how has your assistant psychologist experience made you a better candidate for training. It's speaking about all of your experiences that you've had. So while I am working as an AP now, I actually wrote about my experience as an ABA tutor and also as a healthcare assistant, because those are very formative for me. And so in the same way, you would pick out the 4 values that are consistent across the 4 courses, and then you would draw upon your experiences in your work as a healthcare assistant, research assistant, whatever you're doing, and reflect on it in that way. So yeah, you definitely don't need assistant psychologist experience. How can I show I'm reflective and not just descriptive? So when thinking about the difference between describing and reflection, you need to show what you've learnt in order to move on to that reflective point. Rather than telling someone that you have learnt something or that you have a skill, show them how you've learnt it. So through this, I learnt this skill. I personally like to think about situations where things have maybe gone wrong, where things have been difficult, and so those typically provide the best learning experiences. If you're being descriptive, you're telling someone, okay, I'm good at communicating. But then in order to be reflective, you would say, from this situation, blah, 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 I learned how to communicate better through this. So that's how I would move away from being descriptive and move more towards being reflective. How to make the what, so what, and now what with adding a value and fitting to the word count. So I'm guessing you're asking how to fit everything in. And basically you need to be very much to the point. Don't beat around the bush. Keep the what part of your reflection very brief. Take out phrases such as, this will make me a better candidate because, as that is already kind of stated in the fact that you're applying. Take out the things that you don't need and be very harsh with your edits. Did you include anything about your ethnicity / background in the application? Yes, I did. I spoke about this in the application video. In the final question, which asks about any other relevant factors, I spoke about my background because I thought that it was very much relevant to my application in the way that my background has changed the way that I access certain roles and how I've had to face different barriers and things like that, which did impact my application, my grades, my work, etc. So yes, I did. And those are actually all of the questions that you asked me, guys. So thank you so much for submitting your questions. Follow me on Instagram if you want to be part of the next Q&A at Sharon B Psych. Hit the subscribe button for more videos like this. And until next time, guys, I will see you later. Bye.